health and safety executive, recruiting, as I already said, the expertise it needs with the expansion of its staff, mostly for graduate entry-level posts. And the report concluded that the lack of operational capacity is having a negative impact on the HSE's ability to carry out its work, and the need for a strategy if the regulator is to meet its long-term goals. So we're also seeing the effect of this with stretched regulation prioritising just a fraction of prospective controls on hazardous chemicals compared to the EU. And this year, the UK has rejected controls on 10 hazardous substances which have been targeted by the EU. I'm also very concerned about the change in approach to identifying and controlling substances of very high concern, which we now require additional evidence in the UK to be compiled before regulatory action is taken. And this is raising the bar for adding a substance, resulting in fewer harmful substances getting added to the list. And, you know, I've asked again, what's going on? Why is this big change? No answers are coming from government at all on this at the moment. We are pushing. Please keep pushing from wherever you come from as well. It's really, really important. We need these parliamentary questions answered. So in terms of where we're at the moment now, obviously, sorry, I'm having difficulty with the lights here. There's a central safety data challenge of good chemical regulation as identified in reports by select committees and others, and this is still unresolved. The deadline for companies to submit vital safety data about substances placed on the UK market that are already registered with the EU REACH are due to be put back again for the second time. And on the basis of the most recent timetable, the UK REACH chemical safety database will not be fully populated for another 7 to 8 years. On the basis of recent estimates made by the government, the chemical industry faces costs of £2 billion for re-registering substances with UK REACH, which is twice the cost of initial industry estimates. So we've got a long way to go with this government, which has no idea where it's going with chemical regulation. So it's going to cost more, and yet the system within the EU is already there and working. So why are we not adopting it for the UK? And it's all down to these principles of we're better off out of it than deregulation, which is madness. So I'm looking forward to working with you all on your policy prescription to address the current crisis. And I look forward to the discussions afterwards in the months and weeks ahead. And I believe it's vital that we push for the highest regulatory standards and properly engage with EU REACH and chemical-related laws. That's the only way we're going to be able to prevent the dumping of products on the UK market that fail to meet EU regs and to avoid the cost and complexity of regulatory diversions on the industry. So we need to resist the Tory plans, and we must stop the horse and carriage driven by Jacob Rees-Mogg, which is going to cut standards, regulations and protections. We have no time to waste. And people ask me whether we can afford to do this. Well, I got to tell you, we can't afford not to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. That was a really great start. So I'm going to hand over next to Bill Esterton MP, who's the Shadow Minister for Business and Industry. And I know a number, I mean, I work in science and technology, and a number of my colleagues and friends are really worried about what's happening in terms of the chemical industry, which is a big employer in the UK. So perhaps you'll have more comments about that.
Thanks very much, Melanie. I wish I could. It's the simple answer. Look, Bill Esterton, I'm the Shadow Minister for Business and Industry, as you kindly said. I'm also the Labour MP for Sefton Central, which is half an hour's drive that way, roughly. So welcome to the wonderful Liverpool City region with a very strong chemicals industry footprint. But welcome also to a fabulous city in its own right. People here get curious about why it is that every now and then there's a debate between Manchester and Birmingham as to which is the second city. I mean, after all, we've always known that it's London. Thank you. And just a bit more about the Liverpool City region, the greatest city in the UK. We have the best music, as you will all know. We also have the biggest horse race in the world, the Grand National, which is in my constituency at Aintree Racecourse, and of course the best two football clubs in the world, albeit Everton are going through something of a 30-year sabbatical. Apologies to the Everton fans who've now left in disgust at my comments. But look, we do have this fabulous chemical industry footprint here, and the chemical industry in this country has incredibly high standards that it's developed over many years. It was, at the last figures I looked at, we might get confirmation of this, responsible for 102,000 direct jobs, 24,000 of them in the Northwest alone, and a thriving supply chain. Two companies that I'm familiar with who are owned and managed by constituents of mine, Blends Chemicals and Contract Chemicals, who are based in Knowsley, just a few minutes from my constituency boundary. And they are typical of the industry, which is very strong in SMEs, and that's where a lot of those jobs come from. And they all share this really big concern about the registration scheme and how it would operate. Now, I spoke in Westminster Hall 2.5 years ago as a backbencher. Ruth was the Shadow Minister in response to the debate. And I raised the concerns that Ruth has just highlighted there, which Ruth did as well. And what is really striking is the simplest way to put this is, we told you so. Because everything that we predicted in that debate, which was with grateful thanks to the CHEM Trust and to the Chemical Industries Association, who both provided the evidence for that debate, everything has come true about the impractical and unworkable approach that the government has taken in registering chemicals to be able to ensure the safety that Ruth quite rightly referred to. The fact that 10 chemicals haven't been passed by the Health and Safety Executive just underscores the warnings we gave then about the lack of preparedness of the HSE for its new role, the lack of trained, qualified staff to do the work. And the government at the time predicted that it would take 2 years to replicate the European database. That database took 10 years to prepare. And as Ruth has just reminded us, the government has yet again delayed saying how long it's going to take to have the database ready. Because without that database, it completely undermines the ability of manufacturers in this country to operate effectively, certainly when it comes to international trade. And as we will all know, the chemical industry largely depends on European ownership and overseas ownership more widely. Without a database that is in regulatory lockstep with the European system, it is very difficult to trade internationally. Now, with the Liz Truss admission, after all, that a trade deal with the United States is off the table for the foreseeable future, one of the potential risks has receded somewhat because, and this was one of the things I warned about in February 2020. Had we done a trade deal, that really would have undermined our ability to trade with the EU because of the very different regulatory systems. But even without that prospect, there is still this very significant challenge. And to the points made in the briefing for today, the pollution crisis, we are all acutely aware of the dumping of sewage, and what is also dumped is chemicals. It's been a problem in my constituency into the rivers and waterways. Dozens and dozens of examples last year that were documented, and we've obviously seen raw sewage. I was in Devon in August, and I went to the beach at Sidmouth, and we were on the sea. We saw what was going on. It was on the day when the government admitted that raw sewage was being pumped into the sea, or the water companies did, and you could see it. And that's where we are. And that undermining of the Environment Agency that you referred to, Ruth, guess who it was? Who was the Environment Secretary, who made the decision to cut the budget of the Environment Agency so it couldn't monitor the water companies? It was Liz Truss. Liz Truss, when she was Environment Secretary, made that decision. And now we're paying the price in the poor quality of monitoring and the behaviour of the water companies when it comes to pollution, which is linked to chemicals. But back to chemicals, of course, because those chemicals they don't degrade, do they? They stay in the water system. They end up in marine and plant life, and they end up back in the human food chain. This is really important stuff, and we are going backwards at a rate of knots, as Ruth has set out, in safety when it comes to the chemical industry and its policing and the management of waste. But actually, the chemical industry, as I said earlier, in this country, by and large, wants high standards. They want to trade on the basis of quality, unlike some parts of the world that we could mention. But they can only do that if we've got a regulatory environment that encourages them and enables them and allows to do it. That's why it's so important that the agenda that Ruth set out around a strong regulatory framework that maintains the same high standards and increases those standards as the European Union does. That's got to be the way forward. So when you see the Labour industrial strategy, which we're publishing tomorrow, you'll see in there a reference to how we address this, which is when it comes to the appallingly poor Brexit deal that the Conservatives negotiated, we have to reach agreement with the European Union on areas of regulation, just as we have to do on a number of other areas like a veterinary agreement. And we have to have a constructive engagement and not this megaphone so-called diplomacy of antagonism that has undermined our relationships and our ability to reach agreement on areas like chemicals. That's got to be the way forward. And while I'm on the subject of the industrial strategy, our approach to industry, our approach to manufacturing is to build resilience into supply chains. It's to support manufacturers. It's to encourage and enable the move to low carbon, which actually many in the chemical industry want to play their part in. They can see the advantages for skilled jobs, for opportunities in new products. Many of them are already working on them, but they need a government that's going to be a partner to them. And just as we're doing with the announcement on delivering energy self-sufficiency by 2030 that we've made today, so too across manufacturing and in the chemical industry. We want to play our part as a Labour government on the side of manufacturing jobs, manufacturing industry. We will do that by listening to the needs of the employers and the trade unions. I'm looking forward to hearing what you've got to say in a moment. It's got to be a partnership between government, employer and trade union. That's how we'll deliver not just the retention of those jobs, but the enhancement of what is a very successful industry in this country. That's why we're listening on areas like energy. That's why we earmarked £1 billion in our energy plan for energy-intensive industries, including chemicals, in stark contrast to the government that's sat in its hands over the summer. And it's why we've identified business rates as a key priority, not corporation tax, which is no good to most businesses right now because they're not making a profit. It's why the challenge for us now is, after the disastrous casino economics announcement of a so-called mini budget on Friday, which has spooked the markets, given a run on the pound, and put gilt returns on an upward direction that's going to produce increases in interest rates and increase in the cost for businesses too. That's why we will be opposing those measures. It's why we will make the case for sound money. We will make the case for being a partner. And our industrial strategy will mean that the manufacturers and the workers in those industries really do have a good future under a Labour government. We've got to have the jobs, but we've got to have a safe and secure and appropriately regulated chemicals industry in this country. I think this is a fundamentally important industry. Chemicals are in everything that we use, in everything we make in this country. And if we want a successful country and a safe country, we've got to have a strong chemicals industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bill. So next we've got Andy Prendergast, who is, I'm very excited to say, the GMB National Secretary. I used to be a GMB member, so thank you for joining us, Andy.
Thanks ever so much, and thanks for the contribution so far and for the invite to come and speak here today. I mean, in terms of from a union point of view, following on from Bill's point, we have a vibrant chemical sector in this country. It's 102,000 jobs that are direct, and we estimate somewhere up to 500,000 in the supply chain. And these tend to be good, reasonably well-paid jobs. And that hasn't happened by accident. It happens because they're unionised. And what we're finding, and from a union point of view, chemicals regulation has always mattered. General unionism in Britain was actually built out of a strike that came in 1888 at the Bryant and May factory in London, which was a strike led by a lot of young women. And one of the reasons for that strike, as well as it was pay, as well as it was long hours, was because of the fact that those workers were having to deal with phosphorus on a daily basis. And they used to get a condition called phossy jaw. And phossy jaw, there is a Latin name, which, having not gone to Eton, I'm not even going to try to pronounce. But phossy jaw had a fatality rate of 20%. And for those who didn't die, effectively, their jaw melted. And it was these conditions that ultimately started a process in the late 1880s of general trade unionism. It's where my union, the GMB, came out of. It's where the Transport and General Union, which is now Unite, came out of. And it was the really first time that in British history, trade unionism had moved from skilled trades to general workers. And it was those young women in that factory who ultimately led the way for the union movement of today. And one of the demands of that strike was actually around chemicals legislation. It was about making sure that they can do their job safely. And so as long as we've got people who deal with chemicals, which do make a massive difference for our lives, we have to have very high regulations dealing with how they're used, how the impact they have on the people who make them, the people who transport them, the people who use them, and the environment in which they're used. Because although they make a massive difference, these are often dangerous subjects and so they're dangerous issues, and they need to be treated so as such. So chemicals regulation matters for us all, and particularly the workers in the industries. And that brings us to the issue of the divergence from the EU regulations. Because we've always been believers that we should have the highest standards in industry. We need to be in a position when we're protecting everyone who uses and is exposed to chemicals to make sure the risks are as minimal as they can be, and that we all get the benefit and that people can go home safely. And why that matters in terms of the EU is at the moment, the EU is the gold standard where it comes to chemicals. And it goes back to Ruth's point about divergence, because I'd love to believe what we heard from Michael Gove, that divergence means better. Because none of us would be sitting here at all for a second if we said, you know what, we're going to have better regulations, that we're going to go out in the world and say, actually, we have the highest standards in the world, and we would sell those gold standard products. But instead, what we're finding is that deregulation is ultimately going to lead to worse. And that is going to be a massive problem. And it's a massive problem not only for the people who use it, but also for the very idea of global Britain. Now, we've heard a lot about global Britain over the last however many years, this wonderful thing that was going to be unlocked by getting rid of the red tape from Brexit. But what does it mean? And global Britain, if it's going to mean anything, has got to be the shining beacon we would like it to be, the New Jerusalem that the likes of Clem Attlee used to talk about. It can't mean a bargain basement, second-rate, crap products that don't work, that cause long-term harm. And when we're looking at the EU and the EU regulations, we get into this almost Orwellian position with government. They're not looking to move away from the EU because they have issue with the regulations. They're move away from the EU because they don't agree with regulations per se. I think we have to recognise with regulations, and we keep hearing about it, red tape. How often do we hear red tape? Well, your red tape is our workers' rights. Your red tape is our workers' safety. Your red tape is the difference between people getting long-term issues on health, being able to go home safely, and them not. And so while I agree with the right-wing argument that every law is a restriction and every restriction has to be very carefully considered, we've now got to a position where effectively we have a government who believe laws in themselves are a bad thing. And that is something that is completely unacceptable. So when we're looking at EU divergence, you know, why? Why would we diverge from the standards required by our biggest trading partner? Why would we turn around to a vibrant exporting industry and say, you can meet standards that means you can sell things in Benin that you can't sell in Bonn, that you can sell in Paraguay that you can't sell in Paris? And I think we have to recognise this from the position of global Britain, because ultimately we've had an awful lot of criticism in the sort of post-colonial world. And we've seen it with pharma, where effectively we've used parts of the third world as a laboratory. And it's completely unacceptable. It's post-colonial racist policies. And ultimately, this is what this threatens to unload again. This threatens to bring a situation where we're not only going to be a dumping ground for other countries, but we're going to allow ourselves to dump things in markets that are products that we know are not safe enough to be used in our biggest trading partner. Well, if they're not safe enough to be used there, why should they be used anywhere else? And I think one of the issues we have at the moment is the government divergence, because they don't want to be tied up with red tape, the EU. Well, the options we have is it's either red tape from the EU or it's blue tape from Britain. Either way, it's regulations we need to abide by, and there's strong reasons as to why. And when it comes down to this, divergence for the sake of divergence is pointless. But in this case, it's dangerous. You know, so much damage will be done to us, not only on a sort of a PR basis, but on a moral basis. How can we look at countries and say we are happy to sell you stuff that we know is potentially dangerous? Are we saying that AstroTurf pitches in third world matter, that we're actually happy people to have an increased risk of cancer? Because that's exactly the things we're looking at. So from a union point of view, everything we start with is about the right of workers to work safely. And with chemicals, this has to be at the highest standards. We've had a great record with the industry over the last 150 years of making sure people can go home safely, that their exposure to dangerous chemicals is as low as it needs to be and is a matter of necessity. And quite frankly, it's being threatened we're going to lose that, not on the basis of logic, not on the basis of sense, but purely because there's a right-wing ideology that says regulation is a bad thing. And we have to sit there and say, this is not good enough. When it comes to divergence for the sake of better, we can always do it. And there's always been areas in the EU we've looked at and said, you know what, actually, they're not good enough. You know, if you look at glasses, for example, anyone who wears glasses, our glasses are worse because of alignment with EU standards. It actually meant the variance went down. But there's no problem in bringing that up. And the EU allowed us to do that. And I think when we're looking at this particular kind of legislation, why are we reinventing the wheel? Why are we spending billions and billions of pounds building a register that already exists purely so the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg can go up and talk about how we freed ourselves from Europe? Well, there's no point in freeing yourselves if you're going to end up worse for it. And so all I would say with this is that the work the CHEM Trust are doing is fantastic. We as trade unions are firmly behind it. We're working with the party to make sure there's something fit for purpose moving forward. But this is an issue that is too big to be hidden in small print. And, you know, people have said people voted for the EU because they wanted freedom from Europe, whatever that means. But all I would say is I look lots of arguments for why people voted for the EU. They voted for the EU so we didn't get 80 million Turks. That was never happening coming in. We voted for the EU to put millions of pounds in the NHS. That's not happened. We didn't vote for the EU for worse chemical standards. No one did. We didn't vote for the EU to get chlorinated chicken for America, which no one did. And this argument that the EU is bad is, quite frankly, infantile, it's stupid, and in this case, it's actually dangerous. So we're fully behind the work of the Trust. We're going to be working with the party to protect our members and ultimately lead to a position where we're going to get the highest standards. And we would ask everyone to do everything they can to ensure this divergence doesn't happen. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. That was absolutely fantastic. And if there's anyone here who was wondering why we're here at Labour conference discussing chemical regulation, I guess that they're the people out there. But the answer was there. That was, you know, really, really moving. So next, Chloe, and a huge thank you, first of all, as being the main sponsor of this event. So thank you to the CHEM Trust who have made sure that this event happens, but also Breast Cancer UK and Wildlife and Countryside Link, who've all played a part in making sure this happens. I haven't said already, CERA is a membership organisation. Everything we do relies on the donations of members or the donations of sponsors to help us have these events at conference. So I'm now going to hand over to Chloe Alexander, who's a UK campaigner for the CHEM Trust.
Hi, yes, thanks for introducing me. CHEM Trust is an environmental NGO that works to prevent man-made chemicals from causing long-term damage to wildlife and humans. And we're really pleased to be co-hosting today's event with our co-partners. It's probably quite a while that chemical pollution has been debated on this fringe, but I think it's likely to be a much more regular feature in future. I'll be focusing on 3 issues. I'll be looking at the issue of chemical pollution, why the weaknesses in the UK's regulation that means that it's not up for tackling the crisis, and then what's needed to fix it, a model that would both maintain high standards but minimise costs on industry. So the problem of chemical pollution has been rightly going up the global and national agenda. Many industrial chemicals have improved the quality of our lives. Many are harmful to people or to nature, either kind of disrupting sensitive endocrine systems or, polluting rivers, seas, and nature around the world. It was recently described by the New Scientist as the world's forgotten environmental crisis. The New Scientist led on the UN declaration last year of chemical pollution as the 3rd great planetary crisis, with the 3 crises interlinked and amplifying each other. Also, public exposure to harmful chemicals is also contributing to an increase in the incidence of public health conditions like hormone-related cancers such as prostate and breast, through to diabetes and obesity, and that's one of the reasons why we work very closely with Breast Cancer UK, and the CEO, Tali Martini, is here. We also know that the UK has a quite serious chemical pollution problem. Every single one of the rivers assessed by the Environment Agency in 2019 had levels of chemical contaminants that exceed environmental standards. And water pollution incidences are rising. We've just recently had the pollution of drinking water sources in Cambridgeshire with PFAS, which is a family of 5,000 chemicals which are highly persistent, and all those that have been tested also find that it's toxic too. And that's why we work closely with Wildlife and Countryside Link, and Matt Brown here is their advocacy officer. So is our regulation fit to deal with this crisis? The UK's regime for regulating chemicals is UK REACH, and it's our sort of main tool for controlling pollution at source. So it identifies which substances are harmful and what measures are needed to ensure either safe use or that they're actually not used at all. The system we have has been transposed over from the 2007 EU REACH regulation. And although that's quite right, has provided the highest standards globally, it's failed to speed up regulatory protections in the face of the rapidly growing use of hazardous chemicals, particularly in consumer products. So 30 NGOs have got together and identified 12 asks that we have the UK chemicals strategy, copies of which are on the side over there, which address the need for speed and other kind of weaknesses and gaps in EU REACH. I should also say that all our key asks are reflected in key measures taken forward by the EU to improve their own regulation as part of the EU chemicals strategy for sustainability. So while the EU is kind of stepping up in response to this kind of mounting scientific evidence, the UK is still trying to kind of manage the system, the system that it's just left, and to try and replicate it and try and make it work. And EU REACH kind of has achieved incredible economies of scale. It pulls together and shares data, workload, expertise and resources across all its member states. But as Ruth has just been talking about, that actually it's suffering from some really serious challenges because of lack of capacity, because of a lack of data, and it's also less transparent and open decision making. we've also talked about the cost to industry as well, of having to resubmit all the data that they have already submitted to EU REACH at an estimated cost of £2 billion, which is DEFRA's own figures. And the lack of capacity in the UK system means that actually we're considering far fewer hazardous chemicals for control in the UK, which is kind of creating a protective gap with the EU that's set to become a chasm over the years ahead. So to give one example, restrictions on very harmful chemicals, which either sort of bans that chemical or certain uses of it, or in certain concentrations. The UK has initiated just 2 restrictions since we left the EU. In comparison, 5 have come into force in the EU, another 20 are in the EU pipeline, and a further sort of 5,000 to 7,000 chemicals could be banned by the end of this decade as a result of the EU restrictions roadmap, which targets groups of chemicals of great concern to many people in this room, like bisphenols and flame retardants. And the effect of this is that we're defaulting to divergence that Andy spoke so well about, with no identifiable benefits in this sector, but many considerable costs to industry, but also risking increased levels of chemical pollution in the UK and the dumping of products on the UK market that don't meet higher EU standards. And we don't see any political incentive in departing from standards considered the global gold standard, with polling consistently showing that the public want high standards on chemical safety. So I'd like to kind of end on what's needed. We're standing at a really critical crossroads right now. The potential our options are either to continue to try and replicate the EU in an expensive but less protective way, as we've been seeing so far, or we're facing, to remove rules on UK industry with a terrible, frightening deregulatory drive that we're seeing at the moment, which risks irreparable damage to our environment and is a recipe for chaos. But there is another sort of third way. There is one system that both maintains very high standards, which are pegged to EU's, but also minimises costs on industry. The system in Switzerland is working very well. It doesn't require full registration data for chemicals that are already registered in EU REACH, but it accepts the risk management measures that the EU considers are right, that are needed. But it does have the ability to deviate in a small number of cases. And I'm really pleased that the British Coatings Federation, which is an industry body, has provided me with really supportive of this model as necessary for business as well. And they provided some quotes for me for today. They said that such a system would mean the UK could still follow EU REACH safety standards whilst allowing the possibility for divergence in a few specific agreed cases. It avoids the £2 billion costs to business of registering every substance in a new UK REACH database. It avoids a significant risk of a major reduction in the available substances on the UK market, and of higher costs, which would have disadvantaged UK manufacturers and exporters. It would stimulate growth, allowing access to more raw materials for R&D and boost manufacturing and inward investment. They believe a significant part of UK industry would support such a system, and we really hope that sense will prevail and we will see a more strategic approach to regulatory divergence in the future, where efforts are focused in a small select areas which have the biggest potential benefits, but coupled with a very honest assessment of areas where it makes sense to converge with the EU. And there would be a great deal to be gained from doing that. Thanks.
Well, thank you to all the speakers. Unfortunately, we've lost Bill, but we still have got 3 very key people here. So I'm going to open it up to the floor now. If there's anybody with a question, is there a roving mic, Matt? Or yeah. So there you go. And perhaps we'll take 2. There's somebody at the back as well.
Yes, it's really interesting. had a notebook and I'd recorded it, but maybe I'll be able to look it up online. I come from Dover in Kent. My name's Eileen Robotham. We fought a campaign against fracking, and I think it took part across the rest of the country. And what me, it's not just the earthquakes, but it's the pollution. I was told, I'm sure this is correct, but the chemicals they use could pollute the water table. And the area of Kent we come, we've got aquifers, what that is, but I think it comes directly out of the ground, not from a reservoir. I think that's what it is. And I just wondered if you've got any comments on the dangers of water pollution through fracking, not just from sewage.
And Mike, there was a woman at the back as well.
Hi, I realise you're mainly talking about directly hazardous chemicals, primarily from industry, but I come from Herefordshire, and you might have read about the River Wye and its phosphate pollution. It's not the only river that's affected by phosphates. They're not directly hazardous to us. They're not produced by industry in the sense we usually think of industry. They're produced by agriculture primarily. One's causing problems. There are other sources. And there it is. Part of the problem is that there is no proper monitoring anymore by the Environmental Agency. I don't know whether there's any levels fitted, but at the moment, we're relying on citizen science with all of its problems and strengths and weaknesses to try and monitor the situation. Our MP, Jessie Norman, has raised this in the House, but on behalf of my party, I've tried to get him to commit to campaigning for better resources for the Environmental Agency. Guess what? He hasn't done so. So it's not a hazardous directly chemical to human health, but it's having devastating effects, and it's quite complicated to deal with. It's not just the presence of lots of chicken units in the Wye catchment area, although that's part of the problem.
Right, two very good questions. I was going to spend my summer canoeing on the Wye, and I decided not to. Instead, I swam in Porthcawl, which 2 days before the terrible disaster happened. So let's start with Chloe.
Yeah. On the fracking issue, I'm afraid we're not experts on the chemicals that are used in that process. And I'll take down your email afterwards. I can put you in touch. I can't immediately think of, there are great minds in this room, but in fact I can't think of anyone here who can help. But I'll get in touch afterwards. Yeah, on the phosphate points, really good point. I mean, I just focused on industrial chemicals there, but obviously there are a whole range of harmful chemicals entering our environment, our soil, our rivers, our air, from a variety of different sources that are regulated by different regimes. And I mean, one thing we've been talking about, working very closely actually with Lincoln, is that that the UK chemical strategy needs to consider all the, the kind of wide suite of uses and regulation if we're going to reduce levels entering the environment, and monitoring is a very big issue. We're working quite closely with DEFRA on needing to really up the number of chemicals that are monitored and looking at safe thresholds and so on. I think there will be some more information coming out later this year, actually, on where you'll be able to see much more on localized data, which will be provided by an NGO. So hopefully some interesting but concerning data it will follow. Yeah, on the environment, actually, I think Andy can talk very well on what a poor kind of enforcement would do.
Yeah, no, well, thanks for that. And look, I mean, fracking, and I'm going to make myself really unpopular here because the GMB is not anti-fracking. And I think that's based partially on honesty. Everyone who has gas is using the product of fracking, whether you like it or not. Every bit of North Sea gas we have is fracked. At the moment, on 21 figures, 7.5% of all the gas we used came from American fracking. And the chances are in 2022, because of the situation in the Ukraine, we're expecting about 20% of our gas is currently fracked gas from somewhere else in the world. Now, that's not to say that there aren't significant problems. And I think one of the things we need to do with fracking is there's a question, can it be done safely? as a short-term measure to bridge to when we get to net zero. And no, and I said I wasn't going to make myself popular, but there you go. Okay, well, that's as said. Well, we can pick that up outside. But the point about it is, from your side with fracking, is if it's putting chemicals in and all the rest, that needs to be looked at and it needs to be assessed. And when we have said what we said on fracking, it is with a very, very clear caveat that it needs to be safe and it needs to be explored on that basis. And I think, when it comes down to fracking and everything else, I mean, in terms of the climate issue, no one is, no normal, rational person is denying that there is a climate catastrophe that is around the corner, and the scale of which is absolutely frightening. I was reading something about sea level rises the other day. 30 centimetres are guaranteed, which is going to be massively problematic. 80 centimetres is very likely, which is going to be terrible. And the worst case scenario within 100 years is 52 metres. And 52 metres is at the point at which the UK ceases to exist. It will just be an archipelago off the side of a significantly reduced Europe. And I think the big problem we have with the whole climate debate is currently it seems to resemble a Mexican standoff on a sinking ship. Everyone is sitting there saying something needs to be done, but no one is doing anything about it. At the same point, within this, we have all of a sudden the right-wing attack on green issues, which, if left unchecked, threatens to mean the worst of all worlds for everyone. And our position as a trade union is we somehow have to get through something that's democratically deliverable, that is ultimately going to have the long-term change. And that is going to mean some very difficult decisions coming forward. But I think from your point, if it's shown it causes massive earthquakes, if it's polluting everything, then it doesn't hit the caveat we have, which is safety. And that needs to be looked at. I think on your point about the River Wye, I think you're absolutely right on the whole point about chemicals. And one of the things we discovered in the last many years is the law of unintended consequences. And the most fascinating one of that for me is actually microfibers, microplastics. And for the life of me, I can't understand, if you go back 20 years, all of things, if you ever use exfoliants, that was sand. And some genius somewhere thought, well, there's a cheaper alternative, which is the sand, which was plastic. Well, how can it be cheaper than sand? How have we polluted the world to the point where there's now not a fish in the sea that hasn't got a microfiber in it, caused by some boffin somewhere coming up with a cheaper alternative? And I think we have to look at the environment on every single part of it, and we have to be able to monitor it. And I think that's one of the real worries we have with the EU divergence and a lot of the chemical stuff, is actually the lack of monitoring. Because what we're finding at the moment, particularly with health and safety legislation on all parts, is even when we have good legislation, we have no policing. And a law that isn't policed is not a law worth having. And this is a genuine attempt by the government. The government, and it always goes down to, there was a line from Ronald Reagan in the 80s, which is, the most frightening 8 words known to man is, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And I'll put this, but it's bullshit. You looked at it from the point of view of the pandemic. You look at every natural disaster. The government is our last line of defense. The government should be us. It's our government. We put it in. It's accountable to us. And this anti-government line that they have is just basically a libertarian argument about, the strong. It's Darwinian and it's fundamentally wrong. And ultimately, there's 2 ways of getting around it. Firstly, they get rid of the regulations, and secondly, they get rid of the enforcement. And on every level on this, what we're finding is it's normal working people, normal, vulnerable people who are ultimately affected by it. It's not the people in the mansions. It's not the people who can afford private healthcare. But even then, you have to sometimes ask them, what world do you want? For those billionaires who drive through London, what would you think when you see every door having a homeless person in there? What do you think when, going back to the Bryant and May, does the owner of, Bryant and May matches, were they happy about the fact that 20% of their workforce had no jaw? And this is sometimes what we have to talk about, which is morality. We're good or we're nothing. And so with so many of these things, and I'm sorry if I sometimes make it sound grandiose when you're talking about what seem like really minor bits of legislation, but it comes back to a fundamental question about who do we want to be? And ultimately, we should be a country where we can be proud of being ourselves. And we're not going to do that if it's simply a race to the bottom on every single thing, where profit is put before lives, before public safety, and basically there's a to hell with it approach. So we need to have the regulations, we need to have the enforcement, and ultimately that's the only way forward.
Okay, thank you, Eileen, for your question. It's really helpful that you've talked about fracking. And I have to say, I will give a different perspective to Andy, because from my point of view, there is no earthly way that we should be doing any fracking on the land. I mean, I take your point about offshore, but that's a no-brainer to me. In Wales, obviously, is a moratorium. No, it's been banned completely, as in Scotland. The moratorium in England means that the licenses are still in place, so they can be brought back into, and that's the plan, obviously, because Liz Truss thinks we need to get our energy going again. Now, I would say there's a simple answer to this, and that's renewables. We need to be investing far, far more in renewables. We're not doing the tidal that we should be doing, the lagoons and all the rest of it. Really, really important. The onshore and offshore wind, onshore is the cheapest that we can possibly have. You know, the solar we're not using properly either at the moment. So these are things that we need to be working towards, and we should be doing it now. As Andy said, we can talk all we want, we can navel gaze, but we need the action now. And that's what we are saying in our manifesto. There will be a very clear manifesto to what we're going to be doing in terms of green energy, which was already announced today. In terms of the River Wye, and I'm all for devolution, but unfortunately rivers don't respect devolution. They just flow wherever they want to flow, and they flow in and out of countries, and the River Wye is one of those. And in terms of phosphates, I get a lot of my constituents who in Newport West send me videos of obviously they say you can't smell the smell, but you can see the mess and the scum and all the rest of it on the River Wye. It is a problem there. And the wild water swimmers are very, very clear that they are becoming ill. It may not be phosphates, but what we need to get together with so things like the Environment Agency, Natural Resources Wales, but also the farmers, because the farmers are partially responsible for this. And any farmers, I'm sorry, but this is true. You are responsible for some of this. We need to make sure we all work together as a team to make sure we get things going better. Now, my lovely friend Fleur Anderson from Putney, MP for Putney, has brought forward a private members bill in terms of wet wipes, because at the moment, you look at the wet wipes and it says things like, oh, fully flushable. That is a lie. They are not fully flushable. And, the sewage people will tell you it's not right. So what we need to do is, in terms of microplastics and all the rest of it, we need to be looking back and back and back and saying, okay, we stop it at source. Tumble dryers, we need to make sure that they are properly collecting the microplastics. The wet wipes should not be going into the system. But we all have a responsibility, but it's the government ultimately through regulation that will actually make sure that this works.
Great, thank you. Good questions, good answers. Just one thing for you, Andy. I think you're semi-popular in the room, right? So don't feel too bad. If you want to be super popular, the British Geological Survey has shown that fracking on land in the UK is not safe. The government is now arguing that what was considered not safe should be considered safe. So you have to choose whether the GMB is with the scientists and experts of the British Geological Survey or with the government and their oil company friends. So. We've got about 30 seconds. I don't want to, I think let's have the debate about fracking somewhere else. But I can see two more questions. There's the man at the back and the man at the front who I have a feeling is going to talk about fracking, even though he said he's not.
Hello, thank you. My name's Emmanuel. I'm from Client Earth, and it was just very disappointing, Andy, to hear you saying comments about fracking, because the only people who are going to be getting richer from that are the big businesses, so I was a little disappointed. But the point I wanted to make was specifically on the back of the lady's comments about the River Wye. Client Earth obviously has an interest in protecting nature, protecting the environment, protecting clean air, water, and agriculture, and we've worked with Ruth in the past on defending and making sure we've got clean air in England. So we just wanted to say thank you for that, Ruth. But the work doesn't stop. What do you think, and this is to the whole panel, but specifically to Ruth as well, what would you say are the three things that we need to do to make sure that we've got the right regulation, the right enforcement, with a government that seems intent to roll back all the environmental standards that we've enjoyed so far?
My concern is that as the human race has ignored from the start of the Industrial Revolution the fact that we should investigate all these things before we produce them and inflict them on everything. And that relates to everything. I'm not talking about just fracking or anything else. There's a major mistake we've made as a human race because we've not checked things we've inflicted on the environment and on humans. And that is the major point I would make, and just say what the comment is from everyone. And the other point is that why are the Labour Party supporting nuclear power when it's quite clear that the renewables are going to be cheaper and more effective, and we're still supporting nuclear power. A bit like fracking, we have this sort of gap which we talk about. There is no gap. We can fill that gap with renewables that do not make the situation worse.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, I mean, we can spend the next 3 weeks talking about the client, because, you know, the questions you raise there are brilliant. And I would say it's, and I do feel for the Environment Agency, because they're always blamed and the bad guy. But I mean, their resources have been cut, their staff have been cut massively over the last 12 years. You know, it's very difficult to say, you know, this is what they're doing now when they were doing so much more earlier. It's all very well monitoring, and I was telling somebody a story earlier on. My mum would say, right, sit there and watch the potatoes, make sure they don't boil over, or keep an eye on them. And she'd come back and they were boiled over. He said, yes, they boiled over at 12:20. And you just think, okay, that's monitoring, but that's not enforcement. Okay, so there's two very different, distinct things here. And we need, okay, we can monitor, but we need to know, once we're monitoring, what are we going to do with it? And that's when the enforcement comes in. And at the moment, the fines, if the companies weigh it up, actually cost-benefit analysis is cheaper to pay the fine and carry on polluting. So we need to make sure we do something strongly to either increase the fines, take away licenses, but we need to make sure these regulations come in and come into force properly. The gentleman down the front, yet the environmental catastrophe has been brewing for some time now. You know, wasn't just Greta Thunberg, but it's been going on and on. My constituency is part of it's called Marshfield. In the next 15 years, that's predicted to be underwater. You know, so it's a very, very real situation. We need to get on with this. We cannot be talking about navel gazing, as I've already said. We need the renewables. The nuclear is more nuanced, and I think that's a big issue that we need to take away. We need to discuss that, because the renewables, yes, obviously is a no-brainer, but we need to sort out the storage. We need the national grid as well, because at the moment you can have all the offshore wind you like, but if you can't get it into the grid, it's a waste of time. So I would say, yes, we need a more of a grown-up debate on nuclear.
Thanks. Yeah, and I mean, in terms of your question, what can we do? The key thing is we need to have policing. You know, what was interesting, I was reading something recently about clean air zones. Apparently, there's been no convictions at any point about people using a wood burner in a clean air zone. So what is a clean air zone if there's no policing? And we're finding this at every level, and it comes back to that government attack on legislation and regulation, where we've seen it with the Health and Safety Executive, we've seen it with the Environment Agency. You know, laws which are not enforced are not laws, they're voluntary guidelines. And we really need to beef this up. And I think too often government actually look at this on a very one-sided way. They take a view that regulations kill jobs. And what we found in lots of areas is they don't kill jobs, they move jobs. You know, health and safety legislation actually led to more need for people to go to hospital. So you probably need less doctors and nurses and more inspectors. And, you know, as people who have to deal with the impact of health and safety, you know, if you ever have to phone up someone's family and tell them one of our members has died today at work, which unfortunately I have had to do, you know, it's horrific. And how do you put a cost on a life? And so, you know, in terms of new legislation, there will always be arguments about where is the relevant level. But unless we have policing, it's not going to work. I think in terms of your point, you know, the first thing about, you know, mankind for the last, you know, this climate catastrophe has been brewing since the Industrial Revolution started. And if you look at the history of mankind, you know, effectively it's a blind man sprinting off into the darkness. We don't know what the impact is. And often we don't know what the impact is for too late. I think, as Ruth says, you know, we have a very different view of nuclear. You know, quite frankly, one of the problems there is people do not understand the complexity of energy. And there aren't any single solutions. You know, renewables work to a large degree, but with the increasing requirements of electrification, for renewables to work, we would need to rebuild the entire electric grid, and we'd also have to get £1 trillion worth of batteries. Now, the big problem with getting £1 trillion worth of batteries is that requires lithium. The majority of lithium deposits are currently in Afghanistan. So there are difficulties everywhere you look. Now, our view is quite simply, we need a mixed energy policy. And nuclear, which is clean in terms of carbon emissions, is going to be part of the medium-term solution. What it looks like over a longer period of time as new technologies are developed, like things like green hydrogen. But at the moment, we have a need to keep the lights on. And only by keeping the lights on are we going to keep the public on side for actually moving towards a green future. And the danger is, as I say, is we end up with a reaction. We saw what happened with Brexit, where people felt they weren't listened to. We've already got the absurdly named Net Zero Scrutiny Group, which is a load of tin hat wearing climate deniers. And the danger is we're ceding power to them if we don't address the real needs of people. And I think when it comes down to energy, you know, we have 50,000 members who work in the energy sector, good, well-paid jobs throughout the country. And quite frankly, we're not going to be lead to a green future if I've got to tell all my members in decent jobs that they're not going to exist. And we hear lots about just transition, but it's fantasy thinking. You know, I was sat on one of the Labour Party bodies where someone from a Green group said, oh, we can retrain our gas workers to do offshore wind turbines. Oh, great. So I can tell one of my members in Leicester on 50 grand a year as a gas engineer that he has to go and get a job off the Norfolk coast for which he has no transferable skills whatsoever. It will not work. So we need to have a mixed energy policy moving forward. There are going to be times when we're going to have to be pragmatic. You know, we are going to have to move towards energy security. So we're not having to pay the likes of Vladimir Putin or Saudi Arabia for our energy. And we are going to have debates within our movement about the best way of doing that. And I think one of the key things about our movement, the strength of our movement, is we can have debates and disagreement while actually, you know, what we agree on, we move on and we build, and what we don't, we actually have comradely debate about whether there's the best way forward, informed by science, and people will disagree. And as I said, I'm not expecting everyone to agree with our positions on everything, but, you know, we need to at least recognise where the problem is, understand that climate change is an absolute impending disaster, and work out a way that we can actually deliver a change on it. Because the greatest thinking in the world that's not deliverable is not going to help anyone.
Thanks. So two really important points on the Client Earth one. It's been a bad couple of days, hasn't it, for the environmental sector, and we face quite a battle. I mean, for us on chemicals, that potentially falls within the scope of the retained EU law deregulatory act, and that's extremely worrying. And I hope we can sort of come together. And I mean, I've noticed for some NGOs the gloves seem to have come off, and that we've got quite a fight. I'm sure we'll be working with the trade unions as well on that. And show how these protections are there for people, and they're about the things that people really care about. You know, and that's backed up by polling. The organisation Unchecked have done amazing polling on they did it with swing voters in red wall constituencies, which I was lucky enough to listen to, and actually everybody consistently wanted very high standards, and voted for, many of them had voted for Brexit on the basis that they would see higher standards as well. And they certainly don't, you know, they do not want to see a backward step. You know, people talking about, I want to be able to go into a shop and I can buy anything, you know, including if it's in a power shop, and, you know, I can't be, you know, you expect basic level of safety standards. On the issue of, you know, the big issue for the environmental movement in general. I mean, you know, on chemicals, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, we sit with the EU system, which is the best in the world, and it's about to get a lot better. Officials have just 3 weeks before a new chemical is put on the market. They have no time to kind of check its safety, really. And then it takes EU officials about 13 years to check and properly assess them and to consider whether it's unsafe, and then another, you know, take up to another decade to ban something where all the evidence shows that it is extremely harmful. But in order to kind of meet the sort of evidential requirements for showing harm, the hoops that they have to go through in order to do that, and we really need to kind of speed that up. And that there's a very sort of strong example in chemicals on it took a good few decades to ban PCBs. which were highly persistent, and they continue to pollute and accumulate in our environment. The killer whale in the Atlantic has not one that's had a kind of calf for the last 30 years, and they are heading towards extinction. We've got a similar parallel system with PFAS that I mentioned earlier, which is highly persistent, and you know, it's vital that we have a restriction on them as a group. Got some information on that over there, but they're already. So there was recent scientific data on how it's already in too high a concentration within rainwater to drink. So yeah, but have a look at our PFAS manifesto.
Okay, thank you everyone. I think we are now out of time and probably out of questions. So I just want to thank the panel and thank you for a really interesting debate. And I always think the first event of conference is sometimes quality, not quantity. So I think we've met with the tradition of a really good debate. So thank you all. And don't forget, we here, Sarah's in this room all week and basically all day, every day, there's something going on. Our big rally is tomorrow night. So do come back if you're at a loose end or still want some more debate about the environment. This is where you'll find it. So thank you all and thank you again.